So last week, we began a new sermon series called Gazing on the Starlit Sky, kind of my poetic metaphor for trying to get ourselves back to joy, to understand what real joy is and to try to figure out how to move back toward it, specifically by trying to see, perceive, understand, and maybe begin to overcome some of the things that have kept us from real and profound joy. And I shared with you last week that I don't really think we've taken the topic of joy in this Christian faith seriously at all, not nearly seriously enough. We connect the idea of happiness with kind of happy-go-lucky, so the idea of being serious about joy seems a little like an oxymoron. But I think we need to be serious about joy, and we need to understand what joy is and what has robbed us of it. And to that end, I would really encourage you to go back and listen to the first message from last week it's just called In Wondering About Joy, trying to wonder about what joy in fact is, because it's different from just our kind of cultural or shallow end of the pool notions about happiness. When Paul speaks of the fruit of God's Spirit doing his renewing, transforming, growing work in us, joy is number 2 on that list. You probably know the verse, Galatians 5:22. And the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, and then after that, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and on the list of beautiful attributes of joy goes. And if joy is number 2 on the list of what the Spirit of God is restoring in us, then it must be, this is my conclusion, it must be a major component of what we were made for. We really don't talk about it that much. We all want to be happy with our ideas of happiness, but to say that we were made for joy and that joy has somehow flown the coop, and how do we recover it, is not something Christians really talk about that much, and I wonder why. But it begs the question, if it's what we were intended for, where did it go? How did we lose it, or how have we so often lost it? And one of the ways that our joy is stolen is that we are wounded by other people, and that's what I want to speak with you about this morning. And as I worked on this message, I have to tell you that it's really hard to work on a whole sermon about woundedness and not get depressed, first of all, right? Because you're thinking about not only the wounds in your own life, but the wounds in other people's lives. And secondly, I realized that just the idea of trying to sort of to talk meaningfully about our woundedness and what to do about it in one sermon is ridiculous. But I'm going to do it anyway. What makes this especially complicated for us is that our first wounds are usually received when we're children. Nothing and no one prepares us for this. When we're young children, we just assume that the world will be friendly and that joy will be our traveling companion, but then you aren't picked on the playground, or someone says that you're a weakling, or that you're not pretty enough, or your father speaks harsh words to you, or your mother keeps her emotional distance, or it could be any of 100 or 1,000 other things, and maybe things much worse. When I was a boy, I was teased about 3 things. My name, that's all I heard growing up, was, "Francis, how come your parents gave you a girl's name?" And I'll tell you what, in the soul of an 8-year-old boy, that's a tough thing when you want to be a boy. And the farm fields of Iowa, right? You know, and these are boys that bale hay and feed the pigs and do man kind of work. And then all I heard was and I heard that, and every guy that ever said it to me got away with it, except for John Wolfe in the 5th grade when he in the basement of Washington Elementary School in Fairfield, Iowa, where he found his face in a toilet and my hand on the back of his head. Which I regret. Sort of.
Really?
My name, my size. I was always that, you might think I'm short now, but I grew in high school, actually. And when I was in 8th grade, I heard that, Tim. When I was in 8th grade, there was one kid in the junior high, in my junior high, shorter than me, and he was in 6th grade. I was always grateful for Mike Kokosinski, because there was at least one kid who was short, and we were friends. There was one kid shorter than me. And then my tears, because I was always a tender-hearted kid. And I grew, by the time I was 10 or 11 years old, I grew to hate that about myself. Because boys weren't supposed to be tenderhearted. Boys were not supposed to have compassion. Boys were not supposed to cry when their feelings got hurt. And I was determined by the time I was 10 or 11 years old to be the toughest kid on whatever spot of earth I happened to be standing on. And it sent me on a kind of out-of-control, self-destructive path. And I couldn't have told you back then for $1 million why I was doing all those things, because as children, we have no ability to kind of stand back and psychoanalyze ourselves and objectively understand why we're reacting to life the way that we're reacting to life. Linda used to ask me in our earlier years, because I can explain all this to you now. I understand what I was trying to accomplish by all the ways that I became and the things that I did. But in our younger years, she would hear these stories because she didn't know me when I was younger. We met in high school, but we really got to know each other after high school. And she would say to me when I would tell her stories about the things that I had done, which were bad. And she would say, "What?" Well, first she would say, "Your poor mother." That's what she would say. And then she would say, "What were you thinking?" And I would say, "I don't know what I was thinking. I wonder what your wounds have been, surely different from mine." We see wounding or the results of it in many of the people who inhabit the pages of the Bible. In 2 Samuel, one of King David's daughters, Tamar, is raped by her half-brother. And she's devastated by it, but the story really goes on to focus on the wounded rage of another one of her brothers, Absalom, who is determined to avenge his sister. And for 4 chapters, we watch David and his whole family unravel in dysfunction that leads to multiple murders because no one can deal with their feelings about all the wounding that has happened. Nobody can find a way to actually get through it, and so they just destroy each other, one after the other. In the New Testament, we see Judas, who in every situation is suspicious and shows that his whole life he's been feeling like he's been getting the short end of the stick. That comes from somewhere. And then we meet Peter, who, because he is a pleaser, that's how I would describe Peter, because Peter was a pleaser, he keeps appearing to change his loyalties, right? He's with you, and then he's with you, and then he's with them. That comes from somewhere. And then we meet Paul, who seems angry, aggressive, and comfortable, very comfortable with violence when we first meet him on the early pages of the book of Acts, before he is confronted by the risen Christ. That comes from somewhere. One of the greatest miracles to me in the New Testament, I always think the miracle of the change of the human heart is the greatest miracle. And one of the greatest miracles to me in the New Testament is how that guy, Saul of Tarsus, as Paul the Apostle wrote in 1 Corinthians 13, which you've heard at most weddings you've been to, love is patient, love is kind, love keeps no record of wrongs. How that guy wrote the greatest description of love that I've ever heard in my life. But these people, they were all living out of their wounds, just as you and I do. In John chapter 4, Jesus encounters, some of you know this story, this Samaritan woman at the well. And he comes and he asks her for a drink. And of course, she's a little put off at first because he's a Jew and she's a Samaritan, and there's this rift between Jews and Samaritans. And he says, "Well, will you give me a drink?" And in the course of their conversation, as they're talking about water, Jesus says to her, "Now, if you understood the gift of God," and I think what Jesus means by that is the gift of God is the root of everything. The gift of God is life. He says, if you would have understood the gift of God, you would have asked me, Jesus says, and I would have given you living water. And you would never be thirsty again. He's trying to get her to talk about her soul. You get that? She doesn't want to talk about her soul. So she says, "You don't even have a cup. You don't have a bucket. You got nothing. You have nothing to draw water with. How can you talk to me about drawing? Where are you going to get this water? You got nothing to draw it up with." And so, Jesus is trying to kind of pry open her heart to talk about her journey and what she needs, what we all need. And finally, when she just won't go there, Jesus says to her, "Well, why don't you go get your husband and come back here?" And she says, "I have no husband." And Jesus says to her, "You have well spoken that you have no husband, for you've had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband at all. You have spoken the truth. Jesus says, you're right. You've had 5 husbands, and you're not married to the guy you're shacked up with now. So when I first used to read that, I used to think, boy, Jesus is like, he's really judging her. He's really condemning her. But he's not. He's prying open her wounds. How has this happened to you? How has this happened to you? That all these guys have been able to do this to you, and it's happening to you again. Something needs to be different here for that to stop happening. Something needs to be attended to in your soul. And then, of course, she tries to take Jesus off on a religious conversation. But here's the thing. Our wounding is not really a religious conversation. I believe God holds the solution to our wounding. It's not a religious problem. It's a human problem. It's a soul problem. So what is it that happens to us when we're wounded? I think a couple of things happen. I think one is that the world becomes unsafe. This is what subconsciously every child begins to realize at some point. The world that I thought was completely safe is not as safe as I thought. And the second thing is that our image of ourselves is changed. And some of that depends on the kind of wounds we're talking about, where they come from, and how much of those wounds are things that damage us or shame us. And then I think the third thing that happens, and I couldn't find any other way to describe this, is that I think what it feels like to us is that a piece of us is taken away when we're deeply wounded. Something about who we were that was joyful is lost. We're so crushed, or someone has delivered such a payload of shame into our souls, or we simply can't bear the pain, and so something changes. You could describe it different ways, or maybe it takes different shapes in each of us, but we bury that part of ourselves away. We let part of ourselves die, or kind of go dormant, or we subconsciously harden ourselves and put a protective shield around our hearts so that pain can no longer touch us and burn us. I've often described it as we take all the pain and the woundedness, and we put it in the basement of our souls, and we close the door, and we put a big padlock on it. We say, I'm not going to let that stuff hurt me anymore. I'm not going to let that stuff, I'm not going to get burned by pain again. Or if we can't pull any of those off, we may just become plagued with fear and despair that we can't seem to overcome. I always feel like when I give a sermon like this, I need to talk about it in my own life. But if you are giving this sermon, one of the things that you would realize is there isn't enough time on Sunday morning to talk about all your wounds. There are too many. So I can't tell you about all my wounds. I'll tell you one story, that when I was about 30 years old, I was betrayed by my best friend, who just also happened to be kind of my Christian mentor, so to speak, and my pastor. And it broke something inside me, and I did exactly what I've been describing, or one of the things I've been describing. I hardened my heart to deal with the pain. I was his kind of part-time assistant pastor in the church. I was working my way into ministry, going to school for ministry gradually, and he was my guy. He was kind of my ministry idol. And when all of this happened, which also caused the church we were a part of together to kind of come unglued. That's probably an understatement. This will tell you where my heart was. This is what I said to the Lord. I said, I will always love you, but don't you ever ask me to pastor again. And here I was at what I perceived at the beginning of this pastoral journey, right? I said, don't you ever ask me to pastor again, because I won't do it. It's too painful. I will not do it. And I took all that pain and I shoved it down the best I could. And I said, I've been sacrificing myself for ministry, and my family has no money, and half the time can't pay the rent because I'm putting myself in all this ministry stuff, and I'm going to go off and start another business, and I'm going to make a good living for my family. And I moved from the realm of this to everything I could do out here, and I said, I'm not going to look at that pain. Well, you can see how well that worked out. Lord, I'm never going to do this. I'm never going to do this. Be careful what you tell the Lord you'll never do. because he might take it as a personal challenge. But for a while, I felt this gaping hole where part of me felt like it had gone missing. Lynn and I, we're rewatching right now. Actually, it's the third time, True Confessions, a Netflix series that we have loved called Longmire. Anybody ever watched Longmire? Wow, I'm surprised you guys don't know Longmire. You should watch it. All right, got some Longmire fans right here. All right, so it's about a Wyoming sheriff, white guy named Walt Longmire, whose best friend is a Native American because there's an Indian reservation right nearby, and they grew up together. And they're kind of the two, I guess you'd call them the protagonists of the series. And we were watching an episode last night that's the story of a young Native American woman who is raped, and she's raped by white men on the reservation. And when I first saw this episode, I actually looked it up because I wanted to know if this was true. And if you think there's no racial injustice left in America, on most Native American reservations today, the tribal police cannot touch a white man who assaults or rapes a Native American woman on the reservation because they are not given that authority over white people who commit that kind of crime on the reservation. It's unbelievable. So in this episode that we were watching, this young woman named Gabriella is raped by these white guys, and she's broken. She's crushed. And one of the things, as they're, of course, trying to find the guys and catch the guys and do all of that, and I'm not going to tell you what happens because you have to watch it. But as they're doing all of that, one of the things that Henry Standing Bear, the Native American kind of protagonist, Walt Longmire's best friend, suggests is that Gabriella be taken to a sweat, which is like a Native American prayer meeting around a fire in a teepee to try to find healing or direction in your life. And so this is a sweat for women who have been hurt in these ways by men. And so there's this scene where they're in the sweat, and these women are all in the teepee, and the woman who is leading it, she says to Gabriella, she says, when these men did this to you, a piece of you was lost. And that piece of you is lost, and it's wandering. And she said, I am going to call that piece of you back now. And she begins to sort of call her back, to say, you've got to find this part of yourself again. And then she says to Gabriella, you need to call this piece of yourself back again. And there's this, for me, powerful scene where this young woman sitting there in the light of the campfire with tears streaming down her face is saying to herself, come back, morning star, come back. Because she needs to find that piece of herself again. And that's what I mean when I say when we are deeply wounded, something about us gets diminished. Describe it however you want. A piece of us is taken away, and when it goes, our joy, or much of our joy, often goes with it. And if we don't recognize that, then we just try to tell ourselves that somehow you soldier on through life. But you soldier on as only a part of the person that you were. Which is a good transition to this question. So how do we recover from our wounds, which come in so many varieties, in so many ways, and at different ages and stages of life? And there are a few things I can tell you that I know for sure, not just preacher talk, but out of my own experience about how we recover from our wounds. But I have to caution you that it's not a formula. If you ever hear someone give you a sermon and say, here are the 3 easy steps to recovering from your wounds, don't buy it, because it's crap. It's not a formula, it's soul work, and you have to stay at it, and it takes time, and it has tough moments, and it has moments of epiphanies, and it's different things, but I can tell you some things. So let me give you 4 clues, if you want to call them that, how we recover from our wounds. The first is you have to see it and face it. You have to see that it's even happened to you. I think sometimes people get wounded and it's kind of a good and a bad about the autopilot God's built into our soul. Like there's this part of us that is able to compartmentalize sometimes and just keep going. And sometimes that's good as a survival mechanism, but it also can be part of the process by which we bury away things that need healing, things that need to be attended to. So you have to see it, and you have to face it. Secondly, you have to mourn it. Blessed are those who mourn. You probably know the rest, for they shall be comforted. I think Jesus said that because if you won't mourn, you can't receive comfort. You've buried it away. Your heart is hard. There is no comfort for you if you don't want any comfort. It's like a person who says, you say, oh, do you need stitches for that wound? And they say, what wound? If you want the treatment, if you want the comfort, if you want the healing, you have to say, something has broken me. While that pain is locked in the basement of your soul, you're still holding on to it. You may be in denial about it, but it lives inside of you. And so when you let yourself be sad over it, we so resist sadness. There are moments in our lives, guys, where we need to let ourselves be sad. When we let ourselves be sad over it, it's the first step to being able to let it go. Third, you have to name the lies that the woundings have spoken over you. This was a weird process for me, probably mostly in my 30s and 40s, where I realized that as John Eldridge would say, these arrows that were shot into my soul and that I allowed to remain lodged there, they all spoke certain things over me. And they spoke things that said I was not worthy, I was not strong, I was not competent. Like a lot of people, maybe like most people, I kind of had that feeling that if people saw everything about me, maybe they wouldn't want me. They wouldn't think I was so great. And so we put on our masks and we present a different us than is the real us. And so you have to name the lies that the woundings have spoken about you, what they have made you believe about yourself. I will promise you that in this room this morning, there are 1,000 lies that we still are believing about ourselves. And then fourth, you have to let love in from God and from people. And there's the rub of it. See, there's the risk. Because that open heart is what made you vulnerable in the first place, right? So you said, oh, no, boom, clamp that sucker shut. But healing comes from love, comes from the love of God and the love of people that restores our belief that there is goodness and joy in the universe. I know sometimes people feel like God has abandoned them, but let me give you the other side. I don't know if you remember the story of how I came to Christ, but as I turned 15, I was wounded, and I was afraid, and I felt completely alone in the world. And this speaker on this Young Life retreat described, and I'd been in church all my life, but I'd never heard this description. He described how Jesus was betrayed and abandoned by his friends. And he said these words, so whatever the pain is that you're in, he's been there at the cross. The God who is offering to heal me with his love if I will bring my broken heart to him has been in the depths of my pain. He is a God who has been wounded and yet dares to talk to me about joy. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote these words, the joy of God has gone through the poverty of the manger and the distress of the cross. Therefore, it is invincible. It is irrefutable. I wish I could tell you all the details of precisely how the love of God heals the pain of our souls, but I can't. I want to, as a pastor. I want to say this is exactly how it works, and so here's the checklist, and do this week, and next week do this, and then the next week do this. But it's mysterious. I mean, think about love between human beings. Isn't it kind of mysterious? It's mysterious to me the way that Linda's love for me does certain things in my soul. If you said, describe it, break it down, give me the technical analysis, I'd say, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I have words for all of it. Or the love that my father had for me, or the love of certain friends in my life. It isn't that kind of thing. And so it's mysterious. And so there's a mystery to how the love of God works inside us too. I just know that his love is bigger than all this pain, and that somehow, as he's helped me to soften up and open up my heart, love has drawn near and wounds have been healed. Now, I'm not going to stand here this morning and tell you every wound has been healed completely. There is that promise that one day every wound will be healed completely. So I'm not going to tell you, but I can tell you that wounds have been healed. Things that I used to drag around like a heavy weight from past events in my life and past relationships in my life, I'm not dragging that ball and chain around anymore. Something has happened. Something is different. Now, some of you've been seriously abused, and it's left you with a great deal of trauma. And for you, this is a harder, longer process. And I want to say to you, I get that. I get that. But I want to encourage you, even if that's you, that you have suffered serious abuse at somebody's hands, maybe a parent's hands. Because with serious abuse, they always say it's almost always somebody that you know. Right? Even to you, I want to encourage you not to give up. Even to you whose pain is bigger than what many of us have experienced, I want to say to you, there is love that is bigger than your pain. I can't tell you 3 easy steps to get there, but I want you to not give up. And the last thing I want to say about all this morning is that there is something merciful about our wounds, but I understand that that's a very hard way for us to hear a description of them. For someone to say there's actually some silver lining, some mercy laced into these wounds that we receive. But what I mean by that is that they kind of wake us up out of this Pollyanna idea that there is no great human struggle, that we just need a little more money or a little tweak of our circumstances, or we need some more fun experiences, maybe a new car or the next vacation. Our wounds have the possibility of waking us up to and reminding us that light and darkness are real, that fear and love are real, that wholeness and brokenness are real. John tells us that the whole world has fallen under the spell of evil, and specifically talking about the truth and goodness made visible in Jesus, he says, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but the darkness has not understood it. See, the problem is not just this bad person who wounded you. They may be a bad person, and they have been your problem. The problem, though, is this recurring, dysfunctional, hurtful cycle of pain and wounding that flows downhill from human being to human being to human being to human being, and the whole human race is caught up in it. Understanding that the problem is not just the person in front of me who wounded me. The problem is that we're all caught in the web of a bigger darkness. That has helped me in 2 ways. I want to just describe to you. The first is that it has helped me to see that this person who wounded me was not only a perpetrator, they were a victim. That doesn't make what they did okay, but it helps to explain it. You probably know this phrase, hurt people, right? That's what I'm talking about. And that has helped me to forgive. And I'm not going to stand up here and say forgiveness is always easy. Forgiveness is sometimes very, very hard. But it has helped me to forgive because they hurt me out of their own pain and dysfunction that grew on the tree of their life as a result of their woundedness and pain. And here's the thing. I can be angry at them, but I can't heal their pain. Only God can do that. And that has made it easier for me to release people to God. That's been a helpful image to me. I want to try to just give you a snapshot of. Sometimes when I'm wrestling, because wounding is a lifelong experience, I expect to be wounded again in this life, probably multiple times. It's part of the human experience. I know, somebody's like, seriously? But when I'm wrestling with having been wounded by somebody, I've often found it helpful as I recognize that I can't fix it, I can't change them, I can't heal the pain that made them do or say what they did or said. I can't do any of that. But what I can do is I can say to the Lord, Lord, I can't heal this person. I can't change this person. But you can. So I'm going to release them to you. Now notice in that process, I'm not saying what they did was okay. I'm just saying I'm going to release them to you for you to do whatever you can do because you're way more powerful than I am. And when I do that, it helps me to let it go. The battle is not just against people. But if I think the battle is just against people and not against the darkness, then what happens is I live captive to the darkness in my pain and my bitterness against that person for the rest of my life. That's not where I want to be. And the second thing, when I sort of perceive this larger darkness that everybody is caught up in, is I've realized that other people have been wounded in similar ways to myself, that we're all in this together. It's a common human experience, and that out of my own pain, I have the opportunity to be what Henri Nouwen called a wounded healer. The Apostle Paul described it this way. He says that we may comfort others with the comfort we ourselves have received. What I'm trying to say is there's the possibility of your wounds being converted into compassion for other people who also have been wounded. The tendency with an injury is to protect it, right? To cover it up, to not let anybody touch it, so that we won't be hurt anymore. But we must let the wound be tended so that we can be made whole again, so that we can get back those pieces of ourselves that were stolen. So that we can breathe again. Life, you know how life is supposed to be? So that we can stand in the sunshine again and know, as St. Teresa said, that all shall be well, all shall be well, in all manner of things.